My name is Kate Port, and I'll be your host once again. And I am joined today by Tam Ayers, our field CTO for North America. Hey, Tam.
Hey, Kate. Happy to be back here.
Happy to have you. So today, a topic that I am so excited once again to talk about, the 2022 State of Enterprise Integration Report. So just a reminder and a recap, Tam, I know you know this report inside and out, but for our listeners, this report we launched just about 2 months ago. I guess it depends on the timing of this podcast, but over the summer of 2022, we launched a report and surveyed 1,000 respondents from across North America and the US, including CIOs, web developers, enterprise architects, and all companies had over 500 employees. So very much targeting responses from that enterprise level. And we got respondents from 3 industries: finance, manufacturing, retail. And most of those companies were either from companies in the mid-market, call it $50 million to $500 million in revenue, and enterprise, over $500 million in revenue, and based on that company information we had available. So all of this information was really impactful, not only to how we run our business, but to ultimately how we help to shape where the future of integration is going to go. Now, Tam, overall, reaction to the report, were you surprised? Did it meet your expectations, exceed expectations? What'd you think?
Yeah, I would say that it was definitely very insightful to validate some of the things that we're thinking here at DigiBee and kind of get a pulse on the direction of how enterprise integrations are going. But I will say there was definitely some shocking information and stats in there. We had some ideas around where integrations are prioritized as far as the enterprise IT stack and where those kind of concerns lie, but we didn't really fully understand exactly how many people do or do not have enterprise integration strategies yet, given how important that is and some of the findings that were there. So I'd say it definitely validated a lot of things that we were thinking, but it was also surprising to understand just how the maturity of integrations across the entire landscape are. And this is a really insightful data for us and as well as for everyone that's listening.
I think you nailed it with that last piece, right? This was information that we wanted to know at DigiBee and figured, let's share it with the world, right? Why keep this bottled up? Let's make sure that we can utilize this to help drive innovation forward. So I think there were 3 big takeaways from the report, and feel free to go to digibee.com and download a copy of that. We're happy to share. But those 3 takeaways were that, not surprisingly, poor integration costs the business. Internal alignment on an integration strategy is particularly challenging. And finally, successful and cost-effective integrations are definitely achievable, but it's got to be something that you pay attention to. I think if I were to look at those 3 things, we could certainly call to attention to some of the stats that have been headliners for us, but there are more impactful insights from the report. One in particular is around the impact of poor integrations, right? So we know that integration is important. We know that strategy is important. We know that maybe not everyone is doing that. But then let's take a look at, well, what happens when integrations are not done particularly well? And I think, Tam, when we were catching up, that was one of the things we talked about. So when we look at innovation, we look at lack of agility, what are some of the things that come to mind when integration is not done the right way or particularly well?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the full life cycle of integrations, right? Everything, not just the building and the planning of that, but also the maintaining and the deployment, the extending, they're expensive, right? There's a holistic life cycle there and discrete activities that have to be managed across that. And so while everyone focuses heavily on that build, you have to kind of take a step back and say, okay, maybe the build portion can be done relatively inexpensive with more cloud native solutions that are out there. But what is the true cost, both on hard dollars, but also on time and other types of costs when it comes to maintaining that full life cycle? And so in today's economy where we're likely heading into some kind of recession potentially, businesses are expected to do a lot more with a lot less budget. And trying to manage that tactical versus strategic, especially, and then trying to innovate on top of that, right, to help kind of project or propel the business forward, that's even harder. And so when we're getting stats back that around 50% of respondents are saying that poor integrations have ultimately impacted their ability to innovate and adopt new technologies to ultimately help the CFO, right, help the business grow, which we know that on the CFO's plate from other research that growth is one of the top drivers or top issues for them. Innovation is really something that's going to help do that, right? And so if poor integrations directly, the top response was that it was impeding innovation. And on top of that, we're also seeing that ineffective practices and inefficiencies in general across all of IT is kind of the second highest response, right there, right under 50% of the respondents saying that around what poor integrations are doing to their business. So when you look at those two things alone and think about the overwhelming kind of cost of how much integrations, what the cost of doing that or the cost of having no strategy, it really shows that there's a lot of area for improvement here, a lot of area where you can increase the efficiencies, utilizing different accelerators or more modern integration technologies and ultimately allow you to spend more time on innovation that's ultimately going to project the business forward. There's no tolerance now for things like wasted resources, which again was in that top 5 for what poor integrations means to the business. I mean, around 1/3 of respondents were saying that there were wasted resources on maintaining on these kind of low value tasks where they could be reprioritized to more of those high value tasks. So really the absence of a strategy, not only, while integrations are expensive, that lack of a strategy actually ultimately ends up costing more, when really there are solutions out there that don't cost that much that will ultimately help you, close the gaps and not kind of fall into some of those pitfalls of poor integrations.
It's so interesting because when we think about integration, it's at the foundation of what makes business work, right? So it's this thing that has to happen. And if it's not done well, it sets a really shaky foundation for how things can then be built on top of that. So it's so important for everyone to think about that baseline integration. And it's integration is something that is crucial, but not necessarily the fun, sexy work that we're thinking about when it comes to innovation. But if that foundational work isn't done well, it can really cause that unstabilization that just won't allow you to continue to innovate and add on. So I think that was an interesting one where, again, we assumed things going into the report, but very interesting to see.
Right. And I think that, I was just going to say on that really quickly, there's an interesting stat around how much people are having to re-implement, different integrations, right? 96% of the respondents said that they've re-implemented an integration that they built, they've re-implemented in the past 12 months an integration that they already had made. And so that just goes exactly back towards those comments that you're making as to why is that happening? We've had eIPaaS solutions out there for over a decade, yet, they're not set up in a way to where you're getting reuse and more discoverable reusability so that you're not having to rewrite those integrations as the business adapts and changes. And to me, it just doesn't seem very acceptable that in this day and age and this kind of era that we're in of digital transformation, why integrations are that Achilles heel when really they can be a strategic differentiator for businesses.
Well, amazing tee into the next piece of data that we have at our disposal, which is around downtime. Right? So you're talking about not only being a foundational component, but there's this tolerance level of something that quite frankly should be a non-starter in many cases, where we heard that of respondents, 96% of the respondents said that they had downtime. I want to drill into that stat a little because we expanded on that 96%. So Tam, when you hear that stat and when you saw it, what were some of the interesting components to that stat? Because downtime, nobody wants to have system downtime, right? We hate getting those alerts as consumers. But what does that actually mean? And, how does that stat affect the business?
Directly. Anytime that a system is down, right, especially in integration, that's typically one of the largest areas where something fails, right? Most outages, if I kind of leverage my experience from ServiceNow as their field CTO before coming over to DigiBee here, 80% of outages are caused by some kind of change, right? And typically it is in the infrastructure or in the integration space that typically kind of triggers that outage. And so it's not acceptable, in my opinion, to just assume any kind of outage for any reason as a part of some kind of digital transformation? And if you are, have you taken every single step or every single precaution to make sure that it's either mitigated or not occurred? And so as I start thinking, my entire career has been spent in the enterprise technology consulting space, right? Or working with some of these larger software companies. And I start to think that if I was going in trying to sell a solution or present a solution to a CIO and telling them that there's going to be downtime, I would have some answers there or some tough questions coming from those leaderships around how much downtime and why and how can that be avoided. And so today, I think that CIOs have been sold kind of this bag of goods, if you will, around integrations that might not necessarily be true. You should be asking these kinds of tough questions as a leader: is that downtime really necessary, or is it a byproduct of the specific technology that I'm using that could be mitigated by using something else? So of that 96% stat you're talking about, what was really shocking to me is that around 50%, 48% said that it was more downtime than they expected. So we've got people used to 98.6% saying that there was some kind of outage, but 50% of them said it was more than they even anticipated. And to me, there's just so many other solutions that are out there, ourselves included, that could help mitigate or have no downtime. We're built around that, around having redundancy and failover, attaching to endpoints and satellite systems on the protocols that are already being leveraged today for those integrations, so that we can avoid those kinds of outages and downtime. So to me, it's a matter of, are leaders asking the right questions and exploring other solutions that are out there? Have they been sold different technologies that were kind of empty promises around this? Because again, with over 50% with more outage, more downtime than they expected. Today, I just feel like that's not acceptable to go to the business and say, yeah, there's going to be an outage as a part of this upgrade when there's other solutions that are out there that will make it so that that's not an issue.
So interesting to talk about all of the technologies that are out there to help us solve our problems, right? I mean, ultimately, and we've said this in previous episodes, we want the technology to work for us, not the other way around. And one of the more interesting things about, I think, the report that we collectively at DigiBee talked about was that this space, integrations, there is room to grow. There are room for people to come in and say, we can do this better, whether that's faster, less expensive, in a more supportive way, to reduce that downtime, to think about ways that we can innovate more quickly. And I think that's where DigiBee comes in, and certainly a little bit of a plug. But I think what we found in the report was, there's still opportunity here because the solutions that are out there just aren't cutting it. So, Tam, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure we're going to be together here again. Any parting words before we wrap up about this report that kind of come to your mind, or have we covered all of it?
I would encourage everyone to go and download and look at it, because there's so much more data that we don't have time to discuss, here. But I think that we're seeing here, and this helps validate, and even anecdotally in the conversations that I've had, is that there's so much technology in this space, and we're living in such a great time of digital innovation, of new solutions that are out there, ours included. And I think that the biggest thing that people need to start, or IT leaders need to start asking themselves when it comes to integrations are we building these in the way that we want to build them, tool agnostic, and building these scalable, scalable and resilient integrations? Or are we building them the way that based on how we're limited by some kind of legacy architecture or system? You shouldn't have to make those kinds of trade-offs. You should be able to build the integrations in the business that you want and find solutions that are going to empower you to do that. And I think that that's what ultimately, when people are backed into some of these downtimes or these negative consequences that are found in the report, it's because they've been kind of pigeonholed into building these integrations in a way that and managing these integrations in a way that weren't their first choice, and limited by kind of legacy technology. And so this kind of amplifies and highlights that. So look for solutions that are out there that are going to ultimately allow you to build the business the way that you want to build it, not the way that you feel like you have to because of some limits of some technology, including your EIPAS solution.
Everything should work for you. I love it. Thank you so much once again, Tam. Glad we had a chance to talk about this report. Looking forward to the next one, getting ahead of myself. But certainly thank you for joining us, Tam, and we'll be back with all of you again soon.
Always a pleasure, Kate. Thanks.